Hello everyone, Oli here, and this is my review of Paradise Towers, the second story of the 24th season of classic Doctor Who, starring Sylvester McCoy as the 7th Doctor. Paradise Towers is the 149th story overall, it is 4 parts long, and it's written by Stephen Wyatt. So the plot of Paradise Towers is as follows. According to the sales brochure, Paradise Towers is a utopian blueprint for community living. With its fabulous architecture and state-of-the-art facilities, the perfect place for Mel to take a leisurely swim, in fact. But when TARDIS arrives, the Doctor and his companion discover that the futuristic tower block has fallen into ruin, and a series of unexplained disappearances have the tenants living in fear. As gangs of teenage girls run wild in the hallways, a squad of bureaucratic caretakers struggle to retain control. To keep the citizens of Paradise Tower safe, the Doctor must confront the residents' evil lurking in the basement. So that is the plot of Paradise Towers, and I don't like the story. I absolutely despise Paradise Towers. Never liked it on my first watch as a teenager, and I still hate it now. In fact, Paradise Towers is my least favorite classic Who story. It is just absolutely terrible. I dislike it so much. The production, but then there are some bits that I actually liked, but then they didn't, for me, they didn't really do much to save the story, in fact. Like, the production was quite alright. It was rather, but it did feel quite basic. The sets were quite good, and I do like how run down Paradise Towers looked, and even the little contrast when Mel was watching the intro movie in the TARDIS, and then when the TARDIS arrived, the Doctor and Mel saw that it was not what it seemed. The costuming of the story were quite good. I like the Red Kangs and the Blue Kangs and their costumes because they're in the gang, obviously. The caretakers looked quite cool in their military-esque uniforms, and the script was actually quite good. I did like the special languages that the Kangs were using. Like, they couldn't use die or dead, so instead they said unalive, probably due to the lack of education in the towers, anyways, or they probably found that word scary, dying. But they also couldn't say lie, they pretty much said untruth, so yeah, that I think maybe just a little slang of theirs, but it was quite interesting. And the direction by Nicholas Mallet was also good, but then the execution of the story didn't really do it any justice, in my opinion. The plot wasn't actually bad. It was very understandable, but once again basic because Doctor Who had pretty much done this theme a few times. Plus, I do think this story was too light-hearted. I think it could have been a bit darker, so to speak. I could tell some effort was made by Wyatt to actually try and world build Paradise Towers and the lore of the so-called resident block itself, with having everyone in their own factions of the Red Kang with the Kangs, the Red Kangs, the Blue Kangs, the Yellow Kangs, the Resis, the like elderly ladies, the caretakers who pretty much took care of the towers, and that was pretty much it. So, and obviously had Peck who was dead, and then I'll get more into him later. But I think the world building actually does help in the latest season, with season 25 especially. There's another story he actually writes, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, where the world building that he does with the psychic circus and the lore itself was actually quite interesting because psychic circus was basically in like a metaphor for Doctor Who itself, but I'll explain more on that when I get to that review. Yeah, and I think some of the other faults, getting into it early, I think it was that the plot was too plot driven. I mean, I do think that because it was too plot driven, not a lot of people got a lot of development, especially the Doctor and Mel, and I do think they could have actually benefited from at least some form of development here, and also other characters felt very underdeveloped as well, such as the Blue Kangs. There for they were literally just red Kangs but blue, and they just didn't really have any form of development at all. But I did like the message of unity and how everyone, despite their differences, can all come together and defeat the evil Coragnon, and then that unity still remains after Pex had died to pay tribute to him. And I did like at the end when the TARDIS had had left Paradise Towers, and when there was a little mural at the back paying tribute to Pex, saying Pex lives, and he obviously sacrificed himself to defeat the chief caretaker who has been possessed by Coragnon. Paradise Towers itself was based on a novel called High Rise, which was written by J.G. Ballard, in which a luxury apartment with everything catered for falls into disarray, kind of like Paradise Towers, and it was actually made into a movie and a few years ago, and I think Tom Hiddleston stars in it. I probably would like to see it one day, and I just literally found out about this whilst I was getting my stuff together for this reviews, but so at least Paradise Towers does have that to fall back on. No, I dislike the story. I do think there were some memorable moments, even though there were some moments that were quite charming, like at the start of the story where the Red Kangs met the Doctor and Mel, and the Bin Liner was pretty much demonstrating how their special greeting was like, or some other theatrics, and what made this even even thinking about it just makes me laugh. It had when they were just when Bin Liner was doing, and you obviously had like the chord strikes and the music, and I was just like, oh my god, what is? I was just thinking, what was this? But oddly enough, it was quite charming. But then now that's how that was their how you do. That's what they were calling it, and it was quite funny. But then there was also quite nice as well. I think there was a scene later on in the story when Bin Liner went to rescue the Doctor, and she did the how you do to the Doctor, and it was quite funny as well. It was quite nice as well. But there were some dark moments, although most of the dark moments were very much dark comedic moments. But a dark moment was actually at the start of the story when the last Yellow Kang ended up getting killed by with the cleaners. But then obviously that also was juxtaposed with Mel watching how beautiful Paradise Towers was in the TARDIS. And there was also this very strange cliffhanger in part two when Mel got captured by two Rezzies called Harvey and Tilda, and obviously they were cannibals, and they pretty much tossed the net over her head, trying to restrain her, and then I think one of them was holding the net, and the other was holding some sort of like barbecuing fork, threatening to like they wanted to kill her and eat her, and that was very strange. I did like how the robot clean Nepal was trying to kill her in part four, even though it was a very stupid scene, but then I did like how Mel was able to free herself from the robot from the cleaner that was actually trying to kill her. And the ending was quite nice. And obviously, this is when the surviving Kangs, Rezzies, and caretakers were all paying tribute to Pex, and the Kangs actually gave the Doctor a red and blue scarf to obviously show that unity. And the mural with Pex lives at the back as well. That was also a very nice scene. Even the scene when the chief caretaker was summoned by Coragnon, who was like literally was this little that was the so-called Resident Evil in the basement. How it how he became like Coragnon. How Coragnon pretty much took over the chief caretaker's body. That was also a good scene, but then but those scenes weren't really enough to pretty much save the story in my opinion. The acting, which I thought was a good effort, was slightly better than Time and the Rani, but then because of the execution, because how badly executed it was, they pretty much had to reflect. The acting pretty much had to reflect the bad execution. Sylvester McCoy, I think, did a really good job. He does manage to stand out despite how horrible the story was. He does manage to pull off the goofy, wacky side of the Seventh Doctor, and that pretty much still remains and the last in the previous story. I do like how he was able to trick the caretakers into escaping by getting them to read the rulebook so he can escape, because at the end of part one he was actually mistaken for the chief architect, but then for some reason the caretakers wanted to kill him because he intruded or something. So the Doctor pretty much used that to trick them into saying that they have to let him leave, and then now I do like how they were literally just reading the book, and the Doctor was able to get the security passes, but then he got the wrong one, and then it took him quite some time to find the right one so you can actually escape. And that is actually a bit of foreshadowing as to what the Seventh Doctor's character is really like. So it's very subtle, but then there's a bit, but it was there, and it's a good thing that I caught on to that. And I do like how he has good rapport with Mel, even though they were literally separated for at least 80% of the story, because Mel's purpose was trying to get to the top of the tower so she can go for a swim. But we do get to see how we do get to see how what the Seventh Doctor is like, how he's more determined than other than his previous two generations to actually try and get everyone together to defeat Coragnon. So that was a very good side of the Seventh Doctor, and this is one thing I also like. The Seventh Doctor, he always gets everyone together. Even the other Doctors did it as well, but then there's a way the Seventh Doctor does this by trying to get everyone to, well, most pretty much mostly in his earlier stories, how he gets everyone together to try and stop evil with whoever if you're Nazi or Russian or a green alien or whatever, all coming together to, despite differences, to try and stop evil. And we do see this again in Delta and the Bannerman. I do like how he actually spends time with the Red Kangs to try and pick their brains to understand the situation and to so he can pretty much get to unify everyone together to save the day. And I do think that there are some elements that he could have been from the Red Kangs that are pretty much inspired for Ace's character later on, but yeah. Bonnie Langford was alright, although I do have a huge problem with Mel in this story. She does scream, especially a lot in this story, and she was pretty much split from the Doctor for at least a good chunk of the story. Yeah, because most of her own storyline, as I said before, she pretty much wanted to reach the top of the tower so she can try and swim, but in true Doctor Who fashion, she had to deal with the fucking old ladies trying to eat her, and as well as dodging cleaners and a dodgy lift as well. But then she actually does manage to get to the top of the tower in part four. But then obviously it's not all what it seems. She gets into a swimsuit, and then all of a sudden the robot cleaner pretty much attacks her and tries to kill her. But then Pex pretty much, and obviously Pex was actually with her for at least most of the story. So he couldn't do anything, so he was just because he was a cowardly cutlet, as the Kangs referred to him. But then she pretty much had to grab a gun and pretty much destroy the cleaner itself. And I thought that was a very good scene from her. But then I do think that Mel was being in this story and her wanting to go for a swim was just justification to try and at least pad the plot a bit, obviously of having some fan service of Bonnie Langford in the one piece swimsuit, obviously in the pool and such. But yeah, but then I did like how afterwards, or how after she defeated the cleaner, Pex was like asking her, "You are you alright?" And then Mel was looking at him as if you were literally just standing there. You could have helped her. You could have helped me. And then she gave off that very pissed off look at him, and honestly don't blame her at all because yeah, she was just they left there to fend for herself, which which is something Mel is quite good at doing, but then she doesn't get really any development whatsoever in this story. So on to the side cast. Listed just some were alright, but then not all of them were fantastic. So first off, we had Ben Liner. She was the leader of the Red Kangs, and they all consisted of teenage girls. Her and the other Kangs met the Doctor and Mel when they arrived in the towers, and they were intimidating towards Doctor Mel at first, but then Ben Liner took a liking to the Doctor, especially when she found him in the caretaker when the caretakers captured him and they were doing their "How You Do" greeting. Her and the Red Kangs, along with the Blue Kangs, the caretakers, and Pex and the surviving races helped the Doctor to try and stop Corrigan. And I think she was the best of the entire side cast because she seemed quite interesting. As I said before, I can see where Ace might have been inspired by, especially with the Doctor's interaction with the Kangs and everything. The Kangs were also quite hostile to Mel because they didn't understand her, but when they found out that Mel actually destroyed the robot cleaner in the pool, they were talking amongst themselves and thinking maybe Mel is a Kang after all. No. They also had Fire Escape, another member of the Red Kangs, and it seemed as if she was the second in command, because she was the only member of the Red Kangs that actually got some attention. Fun fact: it ended up being from the story of Tracy Beaker series. Actually, does appear as a member of the Red Kangs, and she also appeared in Doctor Who as well. I think she was one of the people that were fighting the Daleks in the series one finale of New Who. And then in the comics, actually mentions her and Midnighter getting married and having a child. Then we also have Pex. He's the wannabe superhero type that lurks around the towers. And he tells Mel that he's on the mission. He's been sent on the mission, but can't say who from. And he does attempt to save Mel from Tabby and Tilda when they try to eat her, but then they get taken by the cleaners and by the form of a robotic arm that was hidden in their waste disposal. And it's later revealed by the Kangs that he snuck aboard their ship onto Paradise Towers because I think their home planet or something had a war or something. He didn't want to fight in war, so he decided to leave the home planet and was pretty much staying in Paradise Towers. Because he does sacrifice himself to save the Doctor from Coragnon / the Chief Caretaker, and they fall down the mine shaft. But then I think the Chief Caretaker was holding a stick of dynamite, which pretty much detonated whilst on their way down. And then obviously the United Paradise Towers decide to honor him after his death. He's a numpty, and it was pretty clear that he was meant to be a Rambo strongman archetype, but then they had to settle for this scrawny blonde guy, and I can imagine I'm pretty sure they envisioned Pex being like a big, muscular Hulk Hogan-esque sort of character, and if this story was America, if Doc was made in America, they probably would have gotten Hulk Hogan to play Pex, but yeah, they had to settle for this guy. His death was actually quite sad, and the ending where everyone decides to pay tribute to him was quite touching. Even though he was a cowardly cutler, but he was not. But he was a good cowardly cutler who got out of that way to try and save the day. Then we also have Tabby and Tilda. They were elderly residents, and then they're elderly resis, but then which was short for residents. And they meet Mel. They seemed quite lovely, and they were pretty much like your typical grandmother who would love feeding you food, and that's what they were doing to Mel. But then, under that facade, they were just nasty individuals who do anything for survival, including cannibalism, because food was quite scarce. And I'd imagine them eating other Kang members. They initially arrived into the towers and saw everything go to shit, and obviously they tried to eat Mel, but then they were filling up with food so they can so that she can be tenderized and she can have more fat to her. But then it was almost forced by Pex, but then they were taken by the robot cleaners via the waste disposal and their fat, and they were fed to Coragnon. And then we also had Maddie. She was another Resi, and he was friends with Tabby and Tilda, but she was actually concerned about what was going on in the tower, such as caretakers dying on the job, but she was bribed by the chief caretaker with Tabby's flat after they died for her silence. But later, her and the Resi showed up on the top of the floor after the other Resis had been gassed to death thanks to the Coragnon and the cleaners pretty much gassing the entire towers. But then she apologized on behalf of the other Resis in regards to their cannibalism, which the Kangs reluctantly accepted. She does help the Kangs and the other races as well to destroy one of the cleaners, which was also quite cool. And they used this sort of crotcheted blanket type to trap one of the cleaners, so the Kangs could use a crossbow and destroy the cleaners. And of course, the cleaners, there were these white robot creatures. I think they looked like, yeah, this is the cleaner right here. Well, there and there. These white. I mean, the ones that were operating the field, they looked like that, but then they took other forms as well, such as the red cleaner that was in the pool, and the waste disposal chlorum thingy. Though they were used to apprehend Kangs, but it was as if they had a mind of their own, or at least taken over by a mysterious force. Yes, and they actually killed other people, like residents, Kangs, and maybe some Resis as well, or to feed to the mysterious force in the basement, which actually was revealed to be Coragnon. After Coragnon took over the chief, they all answered to Coragnon, but they were all destroyed. Then we have the chief deputy caretaker. It says in the tin, he's the second command to the chief caretaker. He caught the Doctor and took him to the chief, who ordered his death after mistaking him for the Great Architect. But then he and the other caretakers realized that things were not as it seems, because when he met the chief caretaker who had been taken over by Coragnon, he realized that the chief wasn't himself, so they pretty much had to improvise and get away from the chief caretaker, and they allied themselves with the Doctor and as well as the Kangs and the Rezis to try and stop Coragnon. And so he was alright. And then we also have the Blue Kang leader. She led the Blue Kangs, and there were Blue Kangs were also teenage girls. Her and her group of gangs met Pell and Mex first, and the Blue Kangs seemed more intimidating than the Red Kangs. And that's how we found out from the Blue Kangs that Pex isn't what he seems. So the Blue Kangs actually stormed the Red Kangs' brain quarters and proclaimed victory over them, because I think they were playing this game in which whoever enters their compound first wins. But the Doctor convinced them to work together to stop Coragnon. She had no name given in the story, which obviously goes to show how underdeveloped the Blue Kangs were. But I think in the novel of this story, she was actually given the name of Drinking Fountain, and she actually does, the same actress who played the Blue Kang leader actually does return in in the season 24 box set trailer, pitching the new Paradise Towers to Mel, which still has some issues with decorators and caretakers dying on the job once again, which was quite funny, so to speak. And our villains, we have the chief caretaker whose mind was possessed by Coragnon, or at least taken over by Coragnon. The chief caretaker was in charge of Paradise Towers, especially the cleaners, and controlled them as well. When the Doctor was brought to him, the chief ordered the Doctor to be killed after thinking he was a great architect. But the chief was going to the basement to see his pet, where he found it, and he thought and he believed that he was its master, so to speak. And he was actually feeding it dead corpses. And when he noticed this, he actually tried to ask his pet to stop. So because people were starting to notice. But then the chief was brought to the basement by one of the cleaners, and the so-called pet turned out to be Coragnon. He needed a host body, so he decided to use the chief's body. The chief caretaker was quite good, and I think he's played by, I think, Richard Bryce. I think he's another popular actor, but obviously this is way before my time, so he was quite popular then. And of course, you have Coragnon, the actual great architect. So Coragnon was a renowned architect who designed Paradise Towers, and people started losing their trust in him, so they decided to seal them in the basement. So whenever the chief caretaker went to speak to him, he was just a voice in the void or something with some light in the background. And so after Coragnon was able to get stronger and was able to find a host body, which was the chief caretaker. With the use of corporeal, I can't even pronounce it. I think it was corporeal electroscopy. He took over the chief's mind and bodies, and he ordered the cleaners to gas everyone to death, which was never specified for some reason. But ended up killing a good chunk of the caretakers and the Rezis. And he couldn't go up to the pool on 403 because the architect did so himself, so he was pretty much stuck in the lower floors. He dies when he and Peck struggle against the lift shaft after the chief architect Coragnon was trying to throw the Doctor down the lift shaft, but then Pex pretty much intervenes and has a stick of dynamite and hands it over to him, and then they pretty much fall to their deaths, or at least get blown up before they on their way down, which made their deaths very final. And I think Coragnon was very underdeveloped as a villain. We don't see much of him in the form of the chief caretaker in part 4. So his motives as to why he didn't want people in the towers and why he didn't want it fully built was never explained, and his death was just very abrupt. And the faults of the story, even though it can be seen as a very fun, unserious camp story, taking the faults aside, but however, as I said before many times, I think there are stories that actually handles those sort of elements better than this one. Plus, I do find Paradise Towers to be quite boring. If you like the story, that's fine, but I do apologize if you do take my criticisms to heart once again. But I do think that Paradise Towers failed in trying to maintain the balance between seriousness and comedy, but there were some dark themes that we would expect to see in in the Sixth Doctor era, but then the script editing and the comedy pretty much made this into another pantomime story, which was very common in this season because a lot of the acting in the story felt very much like a pantomime and it was just quite silly as well. Well, but I do think the story was very underdeveloped, and Koragnon's reason to prevent Paradise Towers being properly built was, and why he didn't want anyone in the towers was never explained properly, so it's as if the plot was just running on autopilot. And the Blue Kangs obviously felt like extras, and they got no development whatsoever. They were just basically the same as the Red Kangs, but blue, which was quite disappointing. I do feel like they were trying to include some sort of turf war plot into the script, but then it just didn't work at all. It was fine, but then if it was developed a bit more, then it could have worked a bit better. And of course, the Blue Kang leader wasn't actually given a name at all. Even in the credits, she was actually referred to as Blue Kang leader. And obviously, as I said before, the pacing was really, really, really bad. It was too slow to the point where I just completely lost interest. They're just my mind. This I just also happened to me whilst I was watching it as a kid when I was younger. I thought it was quite boring and I thought it was quite stupid as well. But then watching it now, I still think it is quite really still very badly paced, and it was just some parts where I just completely lost interest because it was just the pacing was just way too slow, and then the plot was just too. It felt convoluted, but at the same time, it was just they were trying way too much to. Even though it was too slow, but then they were just feel like they were just trying to add too many elements, and that just made everything, all made the story quite seem very all over the place. Yes, and obviously the tone was just very silly because of the very shoddy writing, and it's a shame because the script was actually quite decent because it was based on a popular novel back in the days, but then the overall story felt as if it was just some lame cartoon. Plot elements like the Resi becoming cannibals was quite strange. I understand why, but it was just very odd, and this story just abuses camp, and it was just very bad. So to conclude, I just think Paradise Towers struggles to maintain the balance of the comedic elements and the more serious elements, and falls victim to what caused Tam and Ronnie to fail, which is and the end product becoming a very pantomimish, cartoonish story, and even its own fault. And I think Paradise House was just very underdeveloped to the point where it was just pretty much just writing on vibes, to be honest. But it was still very clear that Jonathan Turner and Andrew Cotman, what they were doing in this season was not working at all. So I will give Paradise Towers a 2 out of 10. So my next review will be Delta and the Bannerman, which is another unpopular story, but I do have my own thoughts on it. So thanks for watching this story. Please let me know your thoughts of Paradise Towers in this review. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. And until then, Red Kang's the best. See you later.